good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the listening session. I'm Laura Klabansky, and I'm going to be your host. Before we jump into today's topic, I do have a couple of tips for troubleshooting WebEx. If you have issues with WebEx, including any audio problems, we have found that leaving the meeting and re-entering usually resolves those. So give that a try. However, if that doesn't work, you may also try connecting to the meeting via the phone number, which can be found under the WebEx link on the website. So with that, I'll go ahead and move on to today's topic, which is a presentation of Amendment 2 to the Estuarine Striped Bass Fishery Management Plan. So because this plan actually covers all 4 striped bass stocks in the state, we do have 4 staff leads. So today you'll be hearing from Charlton Godwin, Nathaniel Hancock, Todd Mathis, and Joe Fichindola. And the division has developed this plan along with WRC staff who are also on with us today. And that's Christopher Smith and Jeremy McCargo. So we welcome them, and we look forward to getting them into answering some questions when we're finished. So the purpose of these listening sessions is really to provide an opportunity for us, the division, to present the fishery management plan to the public in a low pressure setting where you have the ability to ask questions about the plan itself. So hopefully the outcome is that the public feels better informed as they prepare comments for the advisory committees and for the Marine Fisheries Commission. Today's presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on the website probably tomorrow morning. So the public comment period for Striped Bass Amendment 2 is currently open, and the advisory committees are all scheduled to review and provide input on Amendment 2 next week. So that's the Northern, Southern Regional, and the Finfish standing committees. So I want to clarify that today is not a public comment opportunity, and instead is just an opportunity to learn and engage for us and for the public. After today's listening session, if you would like to provide public comment to the Marine Fisheries Commission or any of the advisory committees, you may do that as described on our website. And if you would like more information, please feel free to contact me. I am the MFC liaison. And I'll be happy to put my email address in the chat along with the web address when I finish. Okay, so following the presentation, we will be taking questions from attendees. We're going to be using the WebEx chat feature. So if you look at your WebEx screen, you should see a chat button down at the bottom right-hand corner of your window. So if you click on that, it should open a chat window on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can enter questions into that chat window at any point during the presentation or after. So please be sure you're sending your questions to all the panelists so we can see them. And once the presentation is finished, I'll be reading out your questions so that the staff can answer them. And I'll be doing that in the order that they're received. So I'll review this once we're finished with the presentation, but for now, I'm going to hand it over to staff lead so they can get started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us for a public listening session about the Estuarine Striped Bass Fishery Management Plan. For those of you joining us who may not know who we are, I'm Nathaniel Hancock, and with me are Charlton Godwin, Todd Mathis, and Joe Fichindola, and we are the striped bass biologists for the division and co-leads for the Striped Bass FMP. Also joining us today is staff from the Wildlife Resources Commission. The Estuarine Striped Bass Plan is a jointly developed plan between the Division of Marine Fisheries and Wildlife Resource Commission staff. This is the division's second public listening session for a plan. The intent of these listening sessions is to have an informal opportunity for the public to learn about the plan and ask any questions about what is in the plan. This is a time for questions, not comments on the plan, and at the end of today's presentation, we will review the ways you may give comment. We will begin with a brief discussion of the history of the Estuarine Striped Bass FMP. The first striped bass FMP under the Fisheries Reform Act was implemented in 2004. Since then, the MFC has adopted an amendment, 2 revisions, and a supplement. These past versions, as well as our most recent stock assessment, are available on the Division FMP website and are excellent resources on the history of striped bass management in North Carolina. Striped bass are a bit different from other species managed in North Carolina. There are 2 estuarine striped bass management units and 4 striped bass stocks in North Carolina estuarine waters. The Northern Management Unit, circled here, includes the Albemarle Sound Management Area, also known as the ASMA, in light gray. This area includes the Albemarle, Croatan, Roanoke, and Currituck Sounds and all the tributaries. And the Roanoke River Management Area, or the RRMA, here in black, which includes the Roanoke River from the mouth up to the dam in Gaston. The striped bass stock in this area is known as the Albemarle-Roanoke, or AR stock, and spawning takes place in the Roanoke River near Weldon. This stock is also managed under the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission because of the migratory nature of the AR striped bass stock. The Southern Management Unit is the Central Southern Management Area, or CSMA, which is in dark gray on the map and includes all waters south of the ASMA. The CSMA has 3 stocks, the Tar-Pamlico, Neuse, and Cape Fear River stocks. Fish in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers mix, but they do not tend to go down to the Cape Fear River, nor do Cape Fear River striped bass tend to move north. Because the CSMA striped bass stocks are non-migratory, meaning they remain resident in the estuary, these stocks are not included under ASMFC management. Moving on to the goals and objectives set for Amendment 2. The goal of Amendment 2 is to manage for sustainable harvest. However, if factors out of our control prevent this, alternate strategies will be implemented to provide protection for and access to the resource. The objectives to achieve this goal are maintaining and restoring spawning stock, habitat restoration and enhancement, monitoring, and promoting stewardship of the resource. We will now discuss the background and history of striped bass and their fisheries in North Carolina. For the AR stock, spawning occurs in the Roanoke River, here in black. Larval fish drift down the river and settle out into the western Albemarle Sound, here in gray, and spread throughout the system to grow. The AR stock is resident at younger ages, then becomes migratory at older ages. After spawning, larger fish, starting at about 32 inches, will migrate north to the New England states in summer and back south in winter. These fish overwinter off the North Carolina-Virginia coast before beginning spawning runs. Tags have been returned from Delaware Bay, Sandy Hook, Long Island Sound, Montauk, and various locations in Massachusetts. The oldest fish ever captured from this AR stock was 31 years old and came from a recreational angler's tag return from the Roanoke River in 2020. This fish was originally tagged in 1995. Spawning runs occur in all 3 rivers in the CSMA, but result in very few juvenile fish. Low abundance of striped bass eggs is a major issue that could prevent natural recruitment in the rivers. This could be because of the absence of older individuals, which produce large numbers of high-quality eggs. Fish in these systems are resident, spending their whole lives in the rivers, and tagging studies show little movement into the oceans or neighboring river systems. The oldest fish observed in the CSMA was about 11 years old. Stocking has helped support these stocks since the early 1980s. And because Roanoke River strain striped bass have either been stocked or used as brood stock since the mid-1970s, there are likely no native or genetically distinct strains of striped bass remaining in these rivers. Age 6 fish are commonly encountered in CSMA rivers, so we know we have an abundance of mature fish, but we're still not seeing recruitment. Since adoption of Amendment 1 in 2013, there's been little change in the size and age structure of these populations. There are several environmental concerns which impact striped bass in North Carolina. Submerged aquatic vegetation and water quality impact all life stages and are being addressed under the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, or CHIP. Fish kills can occur due to natural events, such as low dissolved oxygen levels caused by hurricanes, like we saw in the Cape Fear River after Hurricane Florence in 2018. Invasive species are another concern, such as blue and flathead catfish, and studies are ongoing in North Carolina by the division and UNCW as to the extent that invasive catfish are consuming native species. River flow is an important environmental concern additionally. Fast or slow flows during the spring spawning period may have a negative impact on striped bass spawning success. This is particularly evident on the Roanoke River. In years where flow is optimal, the juvenile abundance is high, opposed to years where flow is above optimal and we have recruitment failure because eggs are washed out of the system and die before hatching. In the Tar-Pamlico River, slow flows impact recruitment. This impact may be greater due to egg densities or weight of the egg. Depending on flow and egg density, eggs may sink to the bottom or die before hatching. Briefly, we will review ASMA commercial landings and ASMA and RRMA recreational landings in pounds by year. On this graph, the solid black line represents the commercial TAL, and the dashed line is the recreational TAL, or total allowable landings. Commercial landings from the ASMA are represented by the blue bars, recreational landings by the orange bars in the ASMA, and Roanoke River recreational landings are represented by green bars. A few specific things to point out. After many years of very poor natural recruitment, the AR stock started having great recruitment in 1993. As the stock abundance increased dramatically, the TAL was also increased through 2002. Starting in the early 2000s, landings in all sectors started to decline, which coincided with periods of lower recruitment. Projections from a stock assessment in 2014 led to a reduced TAL, which was implemented in 2015. Due to continued poor spawns in recent years, the 2020 assessment indicated the TAL needed to be reduced even further. Moving on to the CSMA, commercial and recreational landings by year. Here we have the CSMA commercial TAL represented by the black solid line, recreational landings by the yellow bars, and commercial landings by the blue bars. Since 1994, commercial landings were limited in the CSMA by an annual TAL of 25,000 pounds. Most commercial landings came from the Tar-Pamlico-Pungo rivers and the Neuse Bay rivers, with the remaining coming from the Pamlico Sound and the Cape Fear. There was not a recreational TAL in the CSMA. However, a creel survey was initiated in 2004 to identify and estimate recreational striped bass landings in the CSMA. Recreational landings have fluctuated annually. Currently, the entire CSMA is closed to both commercial and recreational fisheries. The Cape Fear was closed to harvest in 2008 due to abundance concerns, and in 2019, Supplement A to Amendment 1 closed the remainder of the CSMA to protect older age classes of striped bass. It's important to note that even though recreational harvest is closed, there's still a large catch and release fishery in the CSMA, averaging over 28,000 individual striped bass releases or discards in 2019 and 2020. We will now discuss the economic impact of the fisheries. Here we have commercial economic impacts based on data collected through the Division of Marine Fisheries Trip Ticket Program. For the ASMA, we have an average of about 200 participants per year, with average landings of 100,000 pounds per year, worth about $300,000 in dockside value. In the CSMA, we had an average of about 100 participants, with landings averaging about 20,000 pounds per year, worth about $63,000 dockside value annually. Sales impacts totaled about $1.2 million in the ASMA and $251,000 in the CSMA. Recreational economic impacts are based on creel survey data. In terms of the number of striped bass trips each year, the ASMA has the fewest annual number of striped bass trips among the three management areas. The statewide economic impacts of the Roanoke River Management Area recreational fishery are higher than the ASMA and the CSMA because of higher annual trips. Sales impacts are around 1.2 million in the CSMA and 1.8 million for both the ASMA and RRMA. Recreational striped bass effort in the CSMA has increased over time, with corresponding increases in statewide economic impacts. However, as a result of the no possession provision, striped bass effort in 2019 dropped to its lowest level in 10 years, with corresponding decreases in economic impact to the state. The Division of Marine Fisheries and the Wildlife Resources Commission have a lot of ongoing research for striped bass. This includes genetic research identifying which fish are of hatchery origin or not, electrofishing, seining, and trawling to track abundance of the stock, and acoustic tagging to track movement. We have identified research needs to improve future management strategies of the estuarine striped bass fishery. These needs include identifying environmental factors affecting survival of striped bass at all life stages, refining discard mortality estimates, determining mixing rates between AR and CSMA striped bass stocks, expanding, modifying, or developing fishery independent sampling programs, and enhancing recreational and commercial data collection. I'll now hand the presentation over to Charlton Godwin.
Okay, thank you, Nathaniel. So as he mentioned, I'm Charlton Godwin, and I'm the biologist supervisor in the Elizabeth City office and one of the co-leads for the striped bass FMP. Now we will get into the information and issue papers that contain the management strategies and measures for the various estuarine striped bass stocks in North Carolina. Draft Amendment 2 contains 3 sustainable harvest issue papers, 1 issue paper that deals with the potential to use hook and line in the striped bass commercial fishery, and 1 information paper about the history of striped bass stocking in North Carolina. The information paper is used to inform the 3 sustainable harvest issue papers. The issue papers focus on the management strategies and measures for the fisheries and the stocks. The draft FMP is structured so that each paper is an appendix to the FMP for ease of reference. Now we will walk through an overview of each appendix. Appendix 1 provides a history and assessment of striped bass stocking in North Carolina. This information paper covers the systems which stocking has occurred, brood stock used, production methods, and management considerations. The state stocking program is cooperatively managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, DMF, and WRC. Stocking informs management in all sustainable harvest issue papers. And just briefly, just lost my notes for a second. And just briefly, I will mention to everyone, striped bass were one of the first species of fish to be raised in hatchery, and that started right here in North Carolina in the late 1800s with the hatchery in Weldon adjacent to the spawning grounds. So next portion of the presentation is going to deal with these issues concerning the striped bass, Albemarle-Roanoke striped bass stock, which is in the Northern Management Unit and contains the 2 striped bass managed harvest areas, the Albemarle Sound and Roanoke River management areas, or the ASMA and RRMA. So just something to point out here, this sign on the right is a sign they used to have there at the hatchery in Weldon. That's how they used to get anglers to provide spawn eggs to spawn out and rear to fry stage. And so this sign must be about post 1966 or 67, because that's when they first started using the hormone method for producing striped bass. So back to the AR stock. The most recent AR striped bass stock assessment indicated that the stock was overfished and overfishing was occurring. The stock assessment covers data through 2017. Based on stock assessment results, a revision to Amendment 1 was implemented starting in January of 2021, which lowered the total allowable landings to the AR stock to just over 51,000 pounds. And that new tally is projected to end overfishing in 1 year. I do want to take a minute to cover some information about juvenile abundance index we have for the AR stock. So on this axis here, we simply have the average number of fish that are captured during each tow of our trawl. As you can see in the graph, annual recruitment success as measured by the juvenile abundance index is highly variable from year to year. The trend observed of having some really successful spawns followed by poor spawns is a common trend for species that spawn in our coastal rivers, and environmental conditions affect the success of the spawn. What is of major concern here is notice the last several years, since 2017, have all been very below average spawns, really below the spawning failure line, with very few juveniles produced. So that means that availability of fish that are 3 to 6 years old is likely going to be very low in the coming years in the ASMA and RRMA. So now moving on to Appendix 2, which is the issue paper that contains the sustainable harvest management strategies for the AR stock. Stock abundance for the AR is currently maintained through natural reproduction, although stocking has occurred as far back as 1880. Landings have been controlled by a TAL since 1991. The stock experienced a period of kind of overall low recruitment since the early 2000s, which is thought to be a function of spring flooding events. Amendment 2 management measures are aimed at ensuring long-term sustainable harvest and ending the overfished status in 10 years as prescribed by law. And the issue paper explores gear and area restrictions, including a slot limit designed to increase the abundance of older, larger fish. The first issue we will discuss in the option is to operate under a harvest moratorium or continue with the current total allowable landings. So using our stock assessment, we can project forward to see when there will be enough mature females in the population to no longer be overfished. So that is when these three lines get over this solid black bar. And these lines are estimates of mature females under low, average, and high recruitment projection scenarios, which are the gray. That's the low recruitment projection scenario, the average, and the high recruitment scenarios. So under the harvest moratorium, the stock would no longer be fished in about 2024 right here. Managing with a limited TAL is projected to end the overfish status in 2026, taking 2 more years than the moratorium, but still falling well within the 10-year rebuilding. And both of these years of when the stock's going to recover are estimated, assuming the AR stock is in this period of low recruitment, so this lower estimate of abundance, and has been really since the early 2000s. The divisions and the WRC staff initial recommendation is to continue the use of a TAL to manage harvest. It should be noted, however, if we don't get some good spawning events soon, future stock assessment updates could indicate a moratorium is necessary. So now let's move on to option 2, which is to consider continuing to manage the ASMA commercial fishery as a bycatch fishery. The bycatch provision was implemented as a management tool in 1995, and it requires the weight of striped bass not exceed 50% of the total landings. Daily striped bass landings limits in the range from 5 to 15 fish per day also help to discourage fishermen from targeting just striped bass. Discouraging more participants to enter the striped bass fishery limits how quickly the TAL will be caught. If the season was closed early, if the season was closed early, large mesh gillnet fisheries continued to operate after the striped bass TAL was reached would have high numbers of striped bass discards, or those fisheries would have to shut down altogether when the striped bass TAL was reached. Traditionally, most striped bass harvest occurred in the American shad gillnet fishery. However, the gillnet fisheries in the ASMA have changed considerably since this provision was first implemented. Currently, we have a 3-week shad season and a 2-week southern flounder season compared to pre-2014 when the shad sustainability plan came into place, when the shad season ran from about mid-January through mid-April, and flounder nets could be set 11 months out of the year. Participants and therefore trips are in the Albemarle sign management area are now much less than in the 1990s and have continued to decline. And I do want to point out, however, if we were to allow hook and line as a commercial gear, it wouldn't make any sense to impose the bycatch provision on that gear. So the division and the WRC staff's initial recommendation is to maintain the bycatch fishery, noting that if hook and line becomes an allowable gear, the director will have the flexibility to remove the bycatch requirement for that particular gear. So now moving on to option 3, and that includes measures to address what happens when a fishery or fisheries harvest over their TAL. Fisheries managed with a quota, no matter what that quota is called, must have management measures to ensure what happens when a fishery or sector goes over their TAL. First, any harvest that falls below the TAL is never added to next year's TAL. Typically, any overages to the TAL in 1 year are paid back the next year by reducing the TAL by the amount of the overage. In fisheries that have separate sectors that each have an allotment of the TAL, that sector that goes over the TAL pays back their portion of the overage. Payback measures may be stricter depending on the stock status. For example, if the stock status is in good condition, then payback measures may be more lenient. If the stock is in an overfishing state, then payback measures may be more restrictive. In the 1993 FMP, overages of the TAL were paid back by the sector that went over with no buffer associated with the TAL. With the adoption of the 2004 FMP, the TAL had a 10% buffer associated with it. So as long as the total harvest in both the ASMA and the RMA fisheries was not over the TAL plus that 10% buffer, no payback was required. And the reasoning behind that buffer is stated in the issue paper, and that is due to the uncertainty and precision around recreational harvest estimates. So here are the options. Basically, the first two options, 3A and B, compares the total landings from all the fisheries to the TAL to determine if a payback is necessary. The first two options are also associated with a 10% buffer in A and a 5% buffer in B. So option C compares the landings from each individual fishery to that fishery's specific TAL to determine if a payback is necessary, and does include a 5% buffer. And option D is just like option C, except without any buffer around the TAL. And this is one issue the DMF staff and WRC staff have not been able to come to an agreement on. The division recommends option 3D, which includes the TAL accountability measures without a buffer and with pound-for-pound payback. WRC staff, however, do not recommend any of the accountability measures as currently written. In option 3, WRC staff recommend accountability measures that use a 5% buffer for individual fishery TAL, meaning only the TAL overage beyond that 5% buffer would be paid back. And WRC staff, as stated earlier, feel this 5% buffer is necessary to incorporate statistical uncertainty that is inherent to recreational harvest estimates. So, all right, moving on to the fourth issue, size limits to expand the age structure of the stock. Size limits can be used for a variety of purposes. In some situations, you may raise the size limit to reduce harvest if reductions are necessary, and reducing the bag limit is not a desirable option. The use of a slot limit could be used to protect a particular year class or groups of year classes. Minimum size limits are often, but not always, set at a size to ensure some percentage of females are mature and have been able to spawn at least once before harvest. And for long-lived fish, where it is important to the long-term resiliency of the stock to have a very broad age structure with old females in the population, a harvest slot limit can achieve that goal. So think about red drum as a good example. Although the oldest observed age for striped bass in the Albemarle-Roanoke stock is 31 years old, the abundance of fish greater than 9 years old has reduced quite a bit since the early 2000s. Now this graph illustrates a couple of points for striped bass. Up on the top graph, we have the number of eggs in millions produced by striped bass at various lengths. Here's the lengths along this part of the axis and the millions of eggs along here. On the bottom part of the graph, we have the average length, the diamond here. That's the average length at a particular age, age on this side, for female striped bass in the AR stock. So as you can see, once females reach about 25 inches, which is about 7 or 8 years old, the number of eggs produced increases significantly. So a slot limit for striped bass that focuses harvest on the younger fish in the population and protects fish once they get larger and older will, over time, increase the number of these older fish in the population, which is very important for the long-term health of the stock. And so here are the options. We basically have status quo, which is in the Albemarle Sound management area, maintain an 18-inch minimum size limit, and in the Roanoke River management area, an 18 to 22-inch harvest slot, allowing one fish greater than 27 inches to be harvested. Options to increase the minimum size limit. in the Albemarle Sound management area implement an 18 to 25-inch harvest slot, and that pretty much coincides with about 85 or 90% of the harvest we see now in the Albemarle Sound management area of fisheries. In the Roanoke River management area, maintain the 18 to 22-inch slot, but with a one fish greater than 40 inches instead of inches as a trophy fishery. And also in the Roanoke River management area to maintain the current harvest slot limit of 18 to 22 inches and no fish greater than 22 inches allowed. So the divisions and the WRC staff's initial recommendations are for options 4C and 4E. The Marine Fisheries Commission also requested an analysis of the elimination of gill nets in the Albemarle Sound management area, and potentially eliminating harvest in some hot spots, and including catch and release fishing. While the elimination of the use of all gill nets in all fisheries cannot be pursued through the striped bass FMP process, the Marine Fisheries Commission does have the authority to eliminate the harvest of striped bass with gill nets through this FMP process. Elimination of striped bass harvest with gill nets would lead to extremely high levels of discard in the American shad fishery particular and flounder fisheries if those fisheries were to continue to operate. If all gill net fisheries in the ASMA were eliminated through other means, it would have serious economic impacts throughout the Albemarle Sound region. As shown in Appendix 2, there were 234 participants in the multi-species gill net fishery in the Albemarle Sound management area in 2019 that landed 1.3 million pounds of seafood with a dockside value of $1.1 million. So some of the gear modifications to potentially reduce discards from hook and line include requiring the continued required use of single barbless hooks in the Upper Roanoke River during the spawning season, continuing to not allow harvest in the summer months, that's May through September, when water temperatures are warmer. Continued angler education about proper catch and release fishing techniques to help increase the survival of releases, which includes not even practicing catch and release fishing when water temperatures are really warm and survival is very low. Additional restrictions could require the use of circle hooks when using live or cut bait. This is a recent requirement for Atlantic striped bass when using cut bait for striped bass fishing in the ocean. Although it's not popular in North Carolina, it is very popular further up north, and catch and release mortality from recreational fishing is the single largest source of mortality to the coastwide striped bass stock managed by the ASMFC. We could also look at area closures of striped bass hotspots where fish congregate and catch and release numbers are high, including places like the old Mans Harbor Bridge in Manio, the Highway 32 bridge across the Albemarle Sound, Corey's Ditch at the Mackey Island National Wildlife Refuge in Currituck, or on the spawning grounds located in the Roanoke River, or all of some of these locations. So for this particular options, gear modifications and area closures to reduce discard mortality, we have status quo to continue the commercial harvest of striped bass with gill nets and recreational harvest and catch and release fishing in the ASMA and RRMA, including on the spawning grounds, to not allow harvest of striped bass with gill nets, to not allow harvest or catch and release fishing for striped bass on the spawning grounds, to expand the single barbless hook requirement to the entire Roanoke River management area during the striped bass season, and to implement a requirement to use non-offset barbless circle hooks when fishing with live or natural bait in the inland waters of the Roanoke River. That's upstream of the 258 bridge from May the 1st through the June 30th. So the divisions and WRC staff's initial recommendations for this are options 5A and 5E. All right, so this is the last issue for the AR stock. It's option 6, adaptive management. So what is adaptive management? It's a structured process of decision making. It provides flexibility to incorporate new data and information as it is available. It has been used since 1994 in the striped bass fisheries in the ASMA and RRMA to open and close seasons, open and close areas, change daily possession limits, and make gill net modifications as necessary to reduce discards to the greatest extent possible. Also used more recently to close hotspots to reduce interactions with protected species, mainly Atlantic sturgeon up here in the Albemarle Sound, and used to adjust the TAL based on stock assessments and updates to keep fishing mortality below the fishing mortality target. So the division and the WRC's initial recommendations are to support all of the adaptive management measures included in the plan. And so now with that, I will hand the presentation over to Todd Mathis.
So thanks, Charlton. Hi, I'm Todd Mathis. I'm a fisheries biologist in the Washington Regional Office and one of the co-leads for the striped bass FMP. The CSMA is in the Southern Management Unit, which includes all waters south of the ASMA. The CSMA has 3 stocks, the Tar-Pamlico, Neuse, and Cape Fear River stocks. I'm going to be covering the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse Rivers Sustainable Harvest Issue Paper, and then I'm going to turn it over to Joe Facendula to cover the Cape Fear River Sustainable Harvest Issue Paper, and he's also going to be covering the hook and line as a commercial gear issue paper. After reviewing available data, life history information, and stock assessment methods, it was determined traditional stock assessment models were not appropriate for the CSMA stocks. The primary reason is because stocks in these rivers are hatchery supported with limited natural reproduction occurring. The demographic matrix model was developed to evaluate the effectiveness of different stocking and management measures for increasing abundance and expanding the age structure of striped bass in the CSMA rivers. The model did not determine stock status and did not provide a population estimate. Modeling indicates sustainability is unlikely at any level of fishing and is primarily limited by poor natural recruitment. If stocking were to stop, abundance would decline. And continuing stocking in a 10-year closure is the most effective management scenario to increase old adult age 6+ abundance. Additionally, a tagging model was developed for the Cape Fear River. Results showed a consistent decline in abundance from 2012 to 2018. And even with a no possession provision in place since 2008, the 2018 abundance was reduced to less than 20% of the 2012 abundance. Given the specific concerns about these stocks, and because we don't know stock status, management measures in these systems should focus on promoting natural recruitment. One way to do that is to expand the age structure and increase abundance of older, larger fish. Appendix 3 issue paper considers management measures in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers to promote self-sustaining populations. The lack of natural recruitment is the biggest factor affecting striped bass stocks in these river systems, and therefore require annual stocking of striped bass juveniles to maintain their populations. Supplement A to Amendment 1 implemented a no possession measure in 2019 to protect important age classes in order to increase the age structure and abundance of Tar-Pamlico and Neuse River striped bass. Continuing the no harvest possession provision may lead to improved natural recruitment by increasing spawning stock biomass and expanding the female age structure to older individuals. Tie down, distance from shore, and attendance requirements for large and small mesh gill nets have been implemented in the CSMA rivers, which have reduced bycatch of striped bass. Proclamation M6/2019 prohibited the use of gill nets upstream of the ferry lines on the Tar-Pamlico River and the Neuse rivers, and maintain the year-round tie-down and distance from shore restrictions for large mesh gill nets to further reduce bycatch of striped bass. The division supports option 1A, continuing the no harvest implemented in supplement A. Closing the fishery to commercial and recreational harvest provides the best opportunity to evaluate the population response in the absence of fishing mortality. If there are no other significant sources of mortality, such as natural mortality or discard mortality, or other losses to the population, such as fish leaving the river system, no harvest should allow for expansion of the age structure to include fish greater than age 10 to promote natural recruitment. If supplement A management measures are not maintained, alternative management strategies to promote sustainable harvest must be considered to manage harvest. However, because striped bass populations in the CSMA are depressed to an extent that sustainability is unlikely at any level of fishing mortality, alternative strategies beyond the harvest moratorium are unlikely to result in self-sustaining stock. The decision in the Tar-Pamlico and Neuse rivers on establishing areas open or closed to gill netting is a trade-off between providing protection to further reduce striped bass discards given unknown factors affecting natural recruitment, or allowing limited access to other fisheries. If the harvest moratorium is not maintained, the gill net closure alone would be ineffective as a means of protecting striped bass while allowing directed harvest. At the February 2022 Marine Fisheries Commission business meeting, the Commission passed a motion to remove option 2B and 2C from Appendix 3. These were options to allow limited gill net above the ferry lines. Option 2A, maintaining the gill net closure above the ferry lines, is the only option presented for gear restrictions or limits. Adaptive management allows management to be adjusted to respond to data between full FMP reviews. After the FMP adoption, data through 2024 will be reviewed in 2025 by the Striped Bass Plan Development Team. Now I'll turn it over to Joe for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you. I'm Joe. I'm a biologist in the Wilmington office. I've done a bit of work with the tagging and telemetry work, looking at kind of movement and passage over the dams of striped bass in the Cape Fear, as well as doing the surveys looking for those young of the year juvenile striped bass. So in Appendix 4, the Cape Fear River Sustainable Harvest Issue Paper is considering a change in management approach. Historically, the Cape Fear River did support a self-sustaining population of striped bass. However, starting in 1915 and ending in 1935, 3 locks and dams were constructed, kind of blocking the access up the main stem of the Cape Fear River. These dams reduced the striped bass ability to get to their historic spawning grounds at the fall line. And that's kind of where the slow meandering coastal plain portion of the river meets that faster, higher energy, kind of rocky portion of the river there in the Piedmont. And this happens on the Cape Fear around Wilmington, North Carolina. Because of that limited access to the spawning grounds, hatchery-reared fish had been stocked in the Cape Fear River in some extent since at least the 1950s. Starting in 2008, in response to kind of low numbers of documented spawning adult fish, as well as any evidence of those fish producing juveniles, a no harvest provision for both commercial and recreational harvest of striped bass was implemented in the Cape Fear. This paper explores keeping the no harvest provision or transitioning management approach to allow seasonal harvest of that hatchery supported stock. So genetic analysis of the striped bass in the Cape Fear River do show that hatchery origin fish make up a large portion of the overall population of striped bass in the river. However, there is some evidence of natural reproduction occurring in the system. Evidence for this is both that portion of the fish from the genetic analysis that are shown not to be of hatchery origin, as well as us capturing young non-hatchery spawned fish in recent years during young of the year surveys in the Northeast Cape Fear River. Despite this no harvest provision, striped bass do provide an important recreational catch and release fishery in the Cape Fear River for both just kind of individuals and for hire captains. And our NCDMF tagging data shows that striped bass in the Cape Fear system are caught at similar rates as other recreationally important fish statewide. However, even with this stocking of hatchery fish, as Todd said, we have observed a consistent decline in abundance estimates for striped bass in the Cape Fear River between 2012 and 2018. And environmental concerns like mortality due to hurricanes, limited access to spawning grounds did impact the population at this time. However, since the implementation of that no harvest provision, there has been some recent changes which may impact the ability of striped bass to better be able to access their spawning grounds. You can see on the right here, those three pictures are of Lock and Dam 1, the lowermost obstruction in the Cape Fear River that prevents striped bass from the first kind of blockage of striped bass migration. Before 2012, the Lock and Dam looked like that. It was kind of a steep drop that was impassable to fish unless they were locked through the lock chamber or during very high water and they could potentially swim over. But in 2012, there was a nature-like fishway. It's called a rock arch ramp. You can see it there. It's kind of a series, looks like a staircase of rocks essentially there, designed to pass fish that are trying to migrate upriver. And however, when that was built, that was completed in 2012, and in 2016, some passage criteria was developed by it was an interagency work group, and they came up with criteria that were necessary as far as kind of pool width, the opening between the rocks, how deep the pools needed to be, how wide they needed to be for striped bass to successfully pass. And the original construction did not meet that criteria, and studies showed that striped bass weren't passing that structure very well. So just completed in November of 2021, that passage was modified, and you can kind of see there's some larger pools made kind of on the left, all the way on the right, and up the middle. And those pools do meet the passage criteria that striped bass need to successfully kind of pass these kind of structures. And preliminary monitoring of this modified structure is going to happen this upcoming spring here in 2022. Another change that's happened since the implementation of the no harvest provision in 2008 is modified dam flows are developed in 2020 to purposefully release water from Jordan Reservoir during the migration period, which is March and April. And the goal of those modified flows is to fully submerge all three locks and dams. And with the dam submerged, it's thought that the fish may swim over the dam without even needing a passage structure. So those photos on the left, that upper panel shows Lock and Dam 2 kind of during a lower flow when a striped bass would not be able to pass that, kind of just over that. It's kind of crumbling a little bit, but there's still just no real route for the fish to get over. And that bottom panel there is during one of those experimental flow pulses when the dam is completely submerged, and a striped bass could swim just right over it. The first of those modified flow pulses was implemented in the spring of 2021. And that initial monitoring showed that a striped bass could actually swim over that submerged dam. Sorry, I'm dealing with some pollen here. However, the effects of these changes, both the modified fish passage and those flow pulses that are going to have on the ability of striped bass to reach the spawning grounds in the Cape Fear, need to be fully evaluated. And this is going to require a sufficient abundance of large mature fish in the system to take advantage of these structures. So the options for this issue paper are to maintain the no harvest provision, to allow seasonal harvest in the Cape Fear River, to allow seasonal harvest in just the joint and inland fishing waters above the 140 bridge in the main stem of the Cape Fear River, and to allow harvest in inland fishing waters only on the main stem of the Cape Fear River, which would be above Lock and Dam 1, as well as some adaptive management. The no harvest possession measure was implemented in 2008 to increase the age structure and abundance of Cape Fear River striped bass. Maintaining the no harvest provision would continue to limit fishing mortality in the system and protect any fish that are spawning there. Again, this issue is an issue where DMF and WRC had a difference of opinion as far as recommendations. The Division of Marine Fisheries recommends maintaining the no possession provision in order to evaluate passage at the newly renovated lock and dam or during those modified flow pulses, and to further assess the wild spawning that is documented to be occurring in the system. DMF is also concerned that allowing any harvest during the spawning season may target and impact fish which do end up making successful spawning runs or are spawning in the Northeast Cape Fear River. The Wildlife Resources Commission recommends allowing harvest in the Cape Fear River to provide opportunities for harvest of a hatchery-supported stock. Despite 13 years of no harvest, the population remains stocked fish with limited spawning and limited access to spawning grounds. And any additional access is unlikely before the next plan review. Adaptive management would also allow us to assess evidence of natural reproduction and modify management as needed. Finally, I'll review the last appendix, the issue paper that considers the use of hook and line as a commercial gear. This is Appendix 5. In Amendment 1 to the striped bass FMP, rules were changed to allow hook and line to be used in the future as an adaptive management tool if regulation to the use of gill nets required an additional harvest gear. This issue paper examines management considerations with implementing hook and line as a commercial gear, and if it's an appropriate time to allow this gear. Allowing hook and line now as a means of commercial harvest simultaneous with the use of gill nets could be considered a proactive approach that would allow the industry time to adapt to a new means of striped bass harvest. Alternatively, the use of hook and line can be delayed by waiting until potential future restrictions or prohibitions prevent commercial striped bass harvest with the use of gill nets. Considering the no harvest provision in the CSMA, the AR stock status of overfished, and the reduced TAL in the AR, and the potential that adding an additional gear may increase effort in the fishery, the use of hook and line as a commercial gear could be delayed until the stock is recovered to a point where increased harvest can be sustained. So the options for this issue paper are do not allow hook and line as a commercial gear for estuarine striped bass, allow hook and line as a commercial gear, and the adaptive management framework. Amendment 1, management did not approve the use of hook and line at that time. However, the rule change was implemented to allow this to be used as an adaptive management tool as needed in the future. For this issue paper, the recommendation is to not allow hook and line as a commercial gear for striped bass at this time. Due to the current overfished and overfishing stock status and the low TAL in the only management area open to the commercial harvest of striped bass, we recommend not to allow hook and line as a commercial gear at this time. However, we do recommend maintaining it as adaptive management to have it as a potential gear option if needed as the stock status improves. So that ends my portion, and I'll hand it off to whoever is next here. I think Corinne.
I can finish this up, Joe. So finally, we're going to review the FMP timeline. Public and Advisory Committee review for Amendment 2 began March 4th and will close April 1st at 5 p.m. Division staff will update the MFC in May on public and AC input at its May meeting, where they will be asked to select preferred management options. The DEQ Secretary will then have the opportunity to report to the appropriate legislative bodies the significant changes to the plan. The MFC will then have the opportunity to adopt the plan at their August business meeting. During the public review process, there are several ways for the public to make public comment on this plan. You may complete the online questionnaire available on the DMF website. Mail-in comments must be received by 5 p.m. on April the 1st, or you may speak at one of the 3 MFC Advisory Committee meetings. The public may join in person or online. In-person meetings will all be at the Central District Office in Morehead City. However, a listening station will be set up in the Wilmington Regional Office and at the Dare County Administrative Building to speak in person or online. And you must register by 5 p.m. the day before the meeting if you plan to speak at that meeting. So I think with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions about this plan from the public. You will also note the contact information is provided on the screen if you wish to reach out to any of the leads as we go through the next steps in the development of striped bass FMP in case you have any questions. All righty, thank you.
Thank you, Charlton. And so now we'll move into the public comment portion. I do want to remind everyone that we are going to be taking questions via the WebEx chat feature. So again, I'll just review for people who joined a little bit later. If you look at your WebEx screen, there should be a chat button down on the bottom right-hand corner of the WebEx window. So if you click on that, it will open a chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. So you can enter questions into that chat window at any point from now until we're finished. So please just be sure that you're sending your questions to all panelists. I think it says everyone, and just to make sure that we see your questions. So I know that we have gotten some comments from Reese Stecker. I'm going to, it looks like we don't have anyone yet who's asked other questions. So I'll start with Reese's first question. And so we have quite a few panelists this time. So panelists, if you have a response to these, I'm going to start with Charlton since he's on here. And but if anybody else has a response, please go ahead and raise your hand and I'll call on you. And just so you know, the hand raise function, if you're not used to WebEx, it's at the bottom of your participants box, and it's a little tiny hand. So the first question that Reese put into the comments is, are all of the panelists aware that RRMA is the only place in America where there is a catch season for striped bass on the spawning grounds during the spawn? So I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that. I know we heard comments about that during the commission meeting. And so I know this is, you know, a topic that has come up. And Charlton, I don't know if you want to take a first stab at that.
Well, I mean, it's not really, it's more of a statement. I mean, you know, I think that may be correct. They do have some catch and release fishing on the lower portion of the, I think, the Susquehanna Flats, and also some, you know, harvest on the lower portion of the Hudson River. But I think that statement is correct. It's for the ASMFC managed stocks. They don't have you know, catch and release right on the spawning grounds. But that's not really a question. So I think that covers it.
Thank you. All right. So I see we've got some other people. So I'm going to jump down to some other participants, and Reese, I'll come back to your questions when we get to the end of these. So this is, okay, so Mike Wayne, so this is identical to flounder, quoting directly from NOAA Fisheries. Estimates with a PSC of 30% or greater are not considered sufficiently reliable for most purposes and should be treated with caution. So I don't know where specifically that quote comes from, but given that statement, does NCDMS plan to use MRIP or Creel data with PSCs greater than 30 for pound payback accountability measures? So Charlton, I don't know if you can talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. That's a good point. Good question. I know that the some of the councils are dealing with ways to kind of look at paybacks in the recreational fisheries that may be a bit more flexible for some of those fisheries. But specifically for the Marine Fisheries Creel Survey for striped bass in our coastal rivers and estuaries. So not striped bass harvest in the ocean, but the striped bass harvest in the Roanoke River Management Area, Albemarle Sand Management Area, and in the Tar-Pam, Neuse, and Cape Fear rivers. More so the Tar-Pam and the Neuse, I guess. The division, because MRIP, you know, they don't sample that far up the coastal rivers. The division has since 1990, and the Wildlife Resources Commission since 1988 in the Roanoke River. We conduct our own creel surveys specifically for striped bass. So these, again, are a little bit different than the MRIP surveys, which attempt to estimate the harvest of all the recreationally significant species in the ocean. These are just for striped bass. It's just a striped bass creel survey. And typically, our PSEs, you know, are below 30. They're in the 20 to below 30 range. And if anybody, you know, I know we've got staff on for the Wildlife Commission If they have anything to add to that, please jump in. But I think that's pretty much correct. And I think we have our PSEs shown by some of our creel estimates in some of our tables, so we certainly have that information. But because it is a striped bass only creel survey, and we just have staff focused just on that, our harvest estimates are a little bit better than MRIPs, I guess. So, as far as we have not identified, we have not made any mention of if, the PSE is greater than 40, then we will not use that as a payback for accountability measures. Currently, that's not really an option. And like I said, because a lot of that is most of our creel estimates are below, have a PSE less than 30.
Thanks, Charlton. All right, and I'm just looking through the panelists, just making sure nobody else wanted to say anything. All right, so I'm going to go to a question that we got from Joey. He said, is the Cape Fear River still being stocked or has it been abandoned? And I don't know, Joe,
Still being stocked.
if you want. Okay, thank you.
And we stock currently, and since really for the last several years, we've been stocking 100,000 phase 2 fish. So these are fish that are stocked in about October, November, December. They've been grown out since that spring. They were hatched in the hatchery. They're about 6 to 7, 8 inches long, and we stock 100,000 of those fish each year in each one of those systems: the Tar-Pam, the Neuse, and the Cape Fear.
Thanks, Charlton. All right, so I'm gonna go down. I see Bill Gorham. He said, what leads the division to feel it will be, oh, I think it is related to his first statement. So he said, everything in the presentation leads to a harvest closure in the CSMA having a high likelihood of having limited or no impact to meeting the goals of the FMP. And then he said, what leads the division to feel it will be different than the Cape Fear?
Yeah, so this is Todd. I'll take a first shot at that. The likelihood of it having an impact and meeting the goals, the goal is first to achieve self-sustaining populations that provide sustainable harvest. Well, where we really are in the Tar-Pam and the Neuse is that we're trying to achieve self-sustaining populations. We don't really have that now. So we're trying to establish first recruitment before we can get to the sustainable harvest. So, you have to have achieve a sustainable population before you can have sustainable harvest. And so we're just really starting the process. It was only, 2012 probably when we first really knew that we had really limited recruitment in these river systems. So because the division started in 2016 doing some genetic tagging, which was followed, we followed suit of the Wildlife Resources Commission, and that's where we were looking at high hatchery contributions in these river systems. And then in 2017, we initiated a juvenile striped bass seine and trawl survey to try to find individuals and really learned within the last 10 years about the no recruitment in these systems and kind of low egg abundances. So, we have to, first achieve these self-sustaining populations, address the natural recruitment before we can get into the sustainable harvest.
Thanks, Todd.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to pause for a second, see if any of the other panelists have anything else to add.
Yeah, I'll chime in. Just that one of the major differences between the Cape Fear and the Tar-Pam is just the passage issues. There's not, not those blockages to the spawning grounds there. So I guess one thing in the Cape Fear that's hopefully that is going to be addressed with some of these new things that have happened, but in the Tar-Pam, that's just not an issue.
And then Laura also, to that point, in the Tar-Pamlico Neuse, we do have spawning migrations, and they do make it to the spawning grounds and actively, spawn. It's a little different situation, again, because we have active spawning, but we don't have any recruitment. So it's a little bit different situation, just like what Joe was saying. They can't even get to the spawning grounds in the Cape Fear River system.
Thanks, guys. All right, so I'm going to go down. Let's see. So Reese Stucker added a question in. He said, is turning RRMA into a catch and release only location something that is being considered? And this actually has something to do with what was discussed at the Marine Fisheries Commission meeting. I believe it was in November, about their interest in pursuing reallocation of this fishery. And Charlton, I don't know if you want to just relay sort of what they said, or I can do it if you'd rather.
I mean, I don't mind or touching this question too, and I think everyone can still see my screen. Am I still showing the presentation? So Reese,
yeah.
this is in Appendix 2 under Option 5. These were the various options that we looked at for gear modifications and area closures, and keep in mind that the commission kind of specifically asked us to look at a couple of these. So I'll just start out with these. These are the options that are available for the commission members that they approved to go out to public comment. So I guess technically they could choose any one of these particular options. However, specifically, the striped bass FMP is a little unusual in that, the Roanoke River management area, the recreational harvest of striped bass in the entire Roanoke River management area, all the way down to the mouth, is under the jurisdiction of the Wildlife Resources Commission. So technically, I don't, and Laura Glamansky or Corinne or somebody jump in if I misspeak, but technically, I don't think, because of that statute and the way that we jointly manage this plan, I don't think the Marine Fisheries Commission could actually, come up with a recommendation that the Wildlife Resources Commission didn't in turn approve for the management of harvest in that Roanoke River management area. So the answer is no. These options are available, but also they would have to be approved by the Wildlife Resources Commission, as they are the ones that manage the recreational harvest in that system. And again, anybody with WRC or anybody jump in there if I have misspoken.
Thanks, Charlton. I'm just looking for hands. So I do also want to add, and this is related to the questions that Reese addressed to the group before. The Marine Fisheries Director did actually, this is having to do with the allocation question. The Marine Fisheries Director, Kat Rawls, did ask the commission specifically if they were interested in looking at reallocation of the fishery. And they indicated that they would not be doing that in this amendment. So they effectively took that off the table for this go round, just to be clear about that. So I see that, let's see, Bill Gorham has another comment. Let's see. So he says, given the need to build popular fish stocks like southern flounder and resulting strict regulations, do you believe now is a good time to try something never done before, when a limited harvest on a stocked fishery could shift effort away from wild populations of other species like trout and puppy drum and into a stocked population in the CSMA, one that's already been determined to be unable to exist without continuing stocking? And I'll just let any of the panelists that want to jump in on that one. I'm looking at you, Todd.
I'm trying to understand the question a little bit.
So I think, and Bill can speak up if this is a correction, but what I'm understanding that Bill is asking is allowing a fishery on stocked striped bass in the CSMA, whether that's on the Cape Fear or one of the other rivers, according to Bill's question, could potentially shift harvest around off of another unstocked fishery. And he's saying if the stocked population in the CSMA is only ever going to exist with stocking, why don't we just shift the harvest to that? And my first response to that is going to be that, as far as I understand, as the stocks currently stand, they require stocking to be sustained, but that doesn't necessarily mean for all time that they're going to require ongoing stocking. There's still a lot going on that Joe can maybe elaborate on the Cape Feeder, or Todd can as well. Did that clarify the question, maybe, Todd?
Yeah, somewhat. But I'm still not coming up with a good answer for that.
Well, let me just jump in right quick with one thing at least. So, Bill says something that's never been done before. So we've been stocking these 100,000 fish in these systems each year of various sizes, sometimes even more, including phase 1 and fry fish. We've been doing that since for 30 years, and we had harvest on those stocks in the Cape Fear River and the Tar-Pam and the Neuse for all that time. So going back to harvest in those systems wouldn't really be something that we've never done before. What we didn't know back then was the extent that the stocking in this system were supporting the overall striped bass stocks in there. Basically, that there was limited, practically zero natural reproduction going on in the Tar-Pam Neuse, or especially the Cape Fear. We felt that way for the Cape Fear fishery because of all of the passage issues, and that's why indeed we put the harvest moratorium on in the Cape Fear in 2008, much earlier than when it was in the Tar-Pam Neuse. Also understand though that we know that from striped bass tag returns, telemetry data that Todd and his crowd are working on, that there is quite a bit of mixing from the AR stock into the Tar-Pam Neuse, specifically through the Alligator and down the ICW into the Pungo, but also around Stumpy Point, and also in the Neuse River. But when we look at, let's say, fish tagged on the Roanoke River in the spawning grounds, we certainly see more fish in the Tar-Pam than the Neuse, and I think simply because the locality of the systems, and that number of fish that are caught in those systems increases when stock abundance is high. So, the big difference, I think, is now that we understand that, there's just really wasn't any natural reproduction going on, even though there are females in there, stocked females that come from the hatchery, and they are releasing eggs. We're just still not getting recruitment. And again, I think, so that's why both the division and the wildlife commissions for the Tar-Pam and the Neuse at this time want to try the moratorium just a few more years longer to see if that helps, and then maybe it may come to the time to where we can come up with another decision.
Thanks, Charlton. So I see Director Rawls has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I just want to go back to one quick clarification from the discussion relative to the catch and release only and the jurisdictions of the commissions. And Charlton touched on this a little bit, and certainly the Roanoke River Management Area is under the jurisdiction of the Wildlife Resources Commission, and the Albemarle Sound Management Area is under the jurisdiction of the Marine Fisheries Commission. But both of those commissions are by rule required to implement management actions that are consistent with the FMP. So I just want to make sure that we clarify that before we moved on to something else. Thank you.
Thanks, Director. All right. So we had another question from Joey. He said, how many striped bass are stocked, if at all, in the Roanoke River? And how come when years of poor recruitment, there isn't an effort of stocking to help the missing year class of fish?
So very good question. So we stopped stocking fish in the Albemarle Sound, Western Albemarle Sound, in about 1996, after we had, gotten several years of successful spawning, and the stock was pretty much declared recovered. Naturally, spawning populations is the desired outcome. We actually have now, last year, in fact, because we are so concerned with the recent missing year classes of fish, we actually did put in a plan, the Wildlife Commission and the division and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we do have a plan in place, a contingency plan, that under certain flow conditions in the spring, if we have real high flow to where we're just almost going to be guaranteed a poor year class, that we're actually going to start stocking some fish in the Western Albemarle Sound again, where they would normally be found, if those flow conditions happen. So we actually do have a plan in place to stock fish in the Roanoke River if they continue to have poor year classes. But just in general, if the stock is healthy, and they, a poor year class every now and then is something that's just natural, and there should be plenty of year classes around there to support fisheries. Typically the recreational and the commercial fisheries in all of these systems are harvesting fish that are about 3 to 6 or 7 years old in general. So there are about 4 year classes involved there. But right now, in the short term, because we have had such poor recruitment here lately, and until things do improve, we actually have a plan to stock in some situations. So I hope that answers your question.
Laura, you're muted.
Thank you. All right, so we had a question from Bill Tarpley. He said, what is the correlation between post-larval and juvenile survival to available food sources such as the river herring that are no longer available?
I missed the very first little part of that. Does it say what is the correlation to those food sources?
It does. It says, let me read it one more time. It says, what is the correlation between post-larval and juvenile survival, and I believe that's of striped bass,
Yep.
to available food sources, such as the river herring that are no longer available?
Yep, so very, very good question again, and that has been studied quite a bit. So larval striped bass, when they are developing and floating down the Roanoke River, they do have to have food sources, several different food sources actually, as they develop, because as that fish develops, he obviously starts out with a very small mouth opening, which gets larger through time. So as he's floating down the river, they have to have several types of zooplankton, different type of rotifers and other organisms available to that fish, for that larval fish to feed on, until they turn into a juvenile fish and can start moving around. They would not be feeding on larval river herring at that time. So there have been several studies in the Albemarle Sound and Roanoke River through the years. One of the more recent one was actually looking at food zooplankton availability for river herring. One was done by, I believe, Christian Waters with the Wildlife Resources Commission now in the maybe early 2000s, late 90s. A couple of other researchers at ECU have looked in places to see if the zooplankton abundance for not only larval river herring, but also larval striped bass is what it needs to be to support a really rebounding of the river herring population. And so far, what these studies have found is there is sufficient zooplankton to feed these larval fish while they're developing. We do have done larval tows for years for river herring in their spawning areas. And most every time that we actually captured larval fish and brought them back to the lab to ID, whether they were river herring or some other species of fish, all of these larval fish had lots of zooplankton in their gut. So it looks like there is food available at that larval developmental stage in both the the Roanoke River and the Albemarle Sound in general, where those fish when they need them. But yes, in general, they are going to have, once they get a little bit bigger, they are going to have that food availability to as juvenile fish to eat on. And of course, certainly age 3 and 4 striped bass feed on river herring juveniles in the Sound. They're an important source of food, as well as menhaden and other things. So I hope that gets to your question. You're muted, Laura.
Never fails. All right. So WRC staff, I don't know if you have any comments you'd like to make related to that. Just feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. Let's see. So I'm just looking for questions. All right, from Joey, he says, how sensitive is the striper eggs when tumbling down the river susceptible to water quality issues? So I think it's how sensitive are the eggs to the water quality issues that they might experience? Yep,
so another great question. So really there was tons of research done on this in the 80s, all throughout the Hudson River, when the entire striped bass fishery stock on the East Coast crashed. That's the stocks in the Chesapeake Bay and the Hudson. They've done a lot of work on that, and I mean the short answer is they are very susceptible to several different types of man-made chemical compounds. We don't think that that is an issue as far as any sort of pollutants or anything like that in any of these systems. Maybe at least for the Roanoke or the Tar-Pam and Neuse, and really the Cape Fear too, I guess. I just haven't done a lot of studying on that recently. We really don't think that's the issue. We think what more of an issue is the correct amount of flow that these eggs need. Striped bass eggs in the Albemarle-Roanoke River and the Tar-Pam and Neuse in Cape Fear tend to be a little bit heavier than water. So they'll sink if there's not a little bit of flow happening. So they need a minimum amount of flow, but if we get too much flow in the spring, then the eggs may wash out into the floodplain and will not survive just due to low oxygen, dissolved oxygen levels and whatnot. So there has been a lot of research on that through the years, so we know what kind of chemicals and at what developmental stages striped bass eggs and fry are susceptible to. But I think right now that doesn't seem to be the smoking gun like it may have been in the 70s and 80s. That particular part of water quality now, but other issues with water quality like blue-green algae blooms and just eutrophication, which causes these blooms, they certainly could be a concern, probably more to the juvenile stage than the egg stage. But
thanks, Charlton. So I don't see any more questions from our attendees. I'm going to give them just a few more minutes to ask. But I do want to, I have a question of my own. So I'm curious about the stock, our stocks clearly are having some issues with recruitment. And I'm just curious about how that relates to the Atlantic coast stock. The whole thing, like how is that, are we seeing sort of similar trends or is it very different?
Great question, Laura. Luckily, I think I can answer that one. So prior to 2017, if you look, the Chesapeake Bay also has a striped bass creel survey that dates back to 1995, like a recreational striped bass beach seine survey, which dates back to 1955, like ours. And what you see over the very large, the Chesapeake Bay stock, and those fish spawn in the James River, the Rappahannock River, the York, the Pamunkey. They would have gone up to Susquehanna Falls until that dam. All of the rivers on the eastern shore side, they spawn in each one of those major rivers. So when I say Chesapeake Bay stock, that's what we're talking about. And there does seem to be a pretty good correlation between spawning success in the AR stock and the Chesapeake Bay stocks, but I think that's due to just large like 10, 15-year types of El Nino, La Nino weather systems that just affect the general success of like more coastal spawning versus nearshore shelf spawning. But those systems are a little bit different than the Roanoke River in that they don't have that really hard bottomwood swampy area around those rivers like us. So that correlation has kind of been lost since 2017, right? The Chesapeake Bay stocks have not seen the continued the poor spawning every year since 2017, like we have in recent years, but it's just because those systems are a little bit enough different than the Roanoke. But in general, Chesapeake Bay and Albemarle-Roanoke are correlated. The Hudson River stock and the Delaware River stocks, there seems to be no correlation between their JAI and our JAIs. I think we're just maybe too far away geographically.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not quite seeing this situation we're in.
Thank you for answering my question.
Laura, this is Todd. And I would say that as you move just, down south, so, from the points in North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, that's where you would have issues with recruitment. So those more endemic riverine populations have more of the issues than the migratory ones. So
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, thank you for indulging me. So I'm going to go back. Bill Gorham had sort of a follow-up to his question. He said, is now the appropriate time to try to create a self-sustainable fishery on one that has been deemed not self-sustainable without continued stocking? So I think that was a clarification. I don't know if you have more to add to that.
well, I mean, we have said it's not self-sustaining without continued stocking. So what we need to do is we need some time to build up the population because it's been identified that low egg abundance is one of the issues, and so that's why we're trying to increase the number of older, larger fish, really age 10 plus. Like we said in the presentation, we've got kind of a population where we don't have a lot of fish, say, older than 8 years old. And so we need some time to be able to get those fish some protection, to be able to get them old enough that hopefully we would be able to see some spawning and such. So that's kind of the route that we're headed now, is still in that protection phase to try to rebuild that population, where we really, for the entirety of CSMA, we haven't had those older fish. So now it's the opportunity to try to get that, and we'll see if we can do that. We have surveys, our independent gillnet survey, the Wildlife Resources Commission spawning ground survey. Those are in place to monitor that, and then we also have our young of year or our juvenile survey looking for reproduction. So we're trying to monitor that. So
Great, thank you.
I'll chime in for the Cape Fear. I think the issue paper in the FMP right now kind of is asking that question. Is now the appropriate time to kind of make that management change? And some of the considerations, that DMF and WRC, like we were thinking about when asking that question, are kind of some of the things that you set up. I mean, I don't want to be very careful in making any predictions about angler effort changing, but you're suggesting that it'd be, kind of a good way to take pressure off some of these other fisheries by fishing on these stocked fish. And that's, we know in the Cape Fear River that these fish are kind of targeted and captured and reported. The tags is at the same rates as any other recreationally important fish across the state. And we have seen a decline, over the time period that model was looking at, and there was no, harvest, no legal harvest happening. So, what kind of impact opening up would have to the abundance of striped bass in the system, and how long, would that population be able to support, kind of any increase in angling pressure that may happen if that was the only body of water open to harvest in the entire CSMA. There's kind of things we don't know at this point.
Thanks, Joe. All right, so we have another question from Reese Stucker, and he says, are the WRC members concerned that RRMA has 3 times the dead discards than ASMA, and does the WRC have any plans in the future to correct that? So we, I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to take that, or you can just jump in if you.
Sure, this is Jeremy. We are certainly concerned about discard mortality in the RRMA. We do have the single barbless hook rule that has been in place for many years now to require barbless hooks during the spring spawning season when striped bass are in the upper Roanoke River. We have, through this FMP, we evaluated the use of barbless circle hooks when using live and natural bait, which is a rule that we are supporting through the FMP to try to reduce the amount of dead discards coming out of the Roanoke River. So it certainly is a concern that we reduce the amount of discards, or dead discards especially. So I was trying to look at some of the data in response to Mr. Stetcher's questions. And you have to be careful when you look at the tables in the FMP and some of our other documents when you see discards and how it relates to dead discards, because sometimes we report discards as just releases, and those are live releases, and then we apply the mortality rate to get dead discards. So sometimes we report just overall releases, and sometimes it's dead discards. But we certainly want to reduce mortality on those fish that are being thrown back. And, we encourage catch and release practices to minimize the discard mortality. We provide handouts and educational material to educate the anglers on how to properly release fish to reduce the amount that are dying. And that's about, all we can do. And, one of his other questions seemed to be related to, closing down fishing altogether on the spawning grounds, and that's just that's something that we haven't ever done, and we don't think is a necessary activity. When we have the closed season, we have the regulations to limit harvest, and we are encouraging our anglers to reduce the amount of discards and dead discards. So we know the fishery can sustain it as long as recruitment is at high enough levels, and we keep harvest at a low enough level, like we've seen in the past when the population was able to recover in the 90s from low abundance periods. So we don't think that the catch and release fishing is hampering or reducing the population any more than any of the other activities that are going on.
Thank you, Jeremy. Jeremy, while you're on, I had a follow-up, if you don't mind. I know Reese had put some information about the sort of area difference between the ASMA and the RRMA, and I think one thing that brings to my mind is sort of it's not really the area so much of the water. It's more about sort of the level of the or the number of users, and certainly that Roanoke River fishery is a really popular and has been for a long time, and so there's a large stakeholder population that uses that area versus the ASMA. So I don't know if that's a question or if you have any more comments on that.
Yeah, certainly the fishing effort is very high and condensed in a short time frame and a small area relative to the Albemarle Sound. Of course, the physical area of where you can fish in the Roanoke is much smaller than the Sound, and that does concentrate the anglers. But as you said, it's a very popular fishery, a very historic fishery that has been occurring for decades, if not centuries. And so reallocation of the quota is something that you know, the MFC, like you mentioned, decided not to take up during this FMP revision and amendment, but it's definitely something that should be considered as far as, you know, where the harvest comes from and how it's allocated to the different user groups. But I'm not sure that, you know, surface area of the water body is all that important. We can look at the economic impact. We can look at the number of users. We can, you know, kind of keep it as it is and divide it out. And of course, like he also mentioned, the time that the fishery exists or that the season is open. So, you know, it seems to be working pretty well. Some years the Albemarle Sound Management Area recreational fishery reaches their quota, the same as the Roanoke when the fish are available. But it does seem that the effort directed specifically for striped bass is much lower in the Albemarle Sound, and it's spread out over the year rather than just in this 2 months in the spring like it is in the Roanoke, which of course is when the fish are there. There's not that many striped bass in the Roanoke outside of March, April, and May to support any level of effort. So I'm not sure if I really answered a question, but we certainly are aware of the increased effort that occurs in the Roanoke in the short amount of time that the fish are there.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I don't know if any of the other panelists have any more comments. I know Mr. Stecker has some other in the chat if you want to look at those and if you have any response. Other than that, I do not see any more questions. Just give it another minute. And I do want to say thank you to everyone who attended today. We look forward to engaging with our public and being able to answer your questions in this, you know, sort of more relaxed atmosphere. So I hope this has been helpful for everyone. If you have any other questions, I am going to put my email address in the chat, so you'll see that come up. We are going to end this. This will be posted online. It will probably be posted either this afternoon or early tomorrow morning. So, and I also want to say thank you to the WRC staff who have joined us today. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.